Hey guys, welcome back. This time we're going to take a look back at the games that I played when the original PlayStation came out back in 1995. Now, I wasn't able to get a PlayStation on the day that it launched. It was actually a Christmas present that I just happened to know that I was getting. But that didn't stop me from buying just about every PlayStation game that came out up until I could play them on Christmas morning. So this list isn't just launch games. They're more like games that came out before Christmas. At least the ones that I was able to get anyway. With that out of the way though, let's get to those games, starting with probably the weirdest of the bunch. Jumping Flash for the PlayStation was a great introduction to the console. This was one of the bunch of games that I bought before I even received the PlayStation for Christmas, and it was one that intrigued me the most out of all of them. I mean, there weren't too many other PlayStation games where you played as a robot rabbit jumping around in weird themed worlds. It seemed very out of place with the rest of the games that came out around launch. Turns out though, I probably had more fun with this one than most of the other launch games just because it was such a different experience, since this was essentially a 3D platformer before anyone even knew what 3D platformers were. Basically, you take control of Robert, the aforementioned robot rabbit thing. Using your futuristic rabbit tech, you navigate through a variety of stages to collect jet pods scattered around the levels. Think of these like Mario 64 stars, except you need to collect all of them in a single level to open up the exit. These are all mostly hidden around on various platforms in the sky where you have to use Robot's multi-jump capabilities to put together some pretty tricky jumps to get to them. One of the coolest things about Jumping Flash is just how open-ended most levels are, letting you figure out your own path to each jet pod. Being an early first-person platforming game that doesn't even use analog sticks to move around, you'd think this was probably a recipe for disaster, but it's actually not too bad. The on-the-foot gameplay where you run around and shoot enemies isn't too good, but the actual act of platforming is surprisingly playable since the camera angles down for each multi-jump you do. And since this is what you're doing most of the game, it's pretty easy to forgive the lackluster shooting. I really liked this one a lot back then, and it's one that I still come back to occasionally. Thankfully, you can still grab this one on the PlayStation Store if you want to check out one of the weirder launch games for the console. Speaking of first-person shooters, here's Doom for the PlayStation. Now, I had never actually played a proper version of Doom until the PlayStation game came out. The only other Doom experience that I had was the Super NES version of Doom, which, while it was kinda neat, didn't exactly make me see why everyone was going crazy for this one over in PC land. In fact, I just kinda thought that first-person shooter games were a fad and would soon die out when everyone realized how lame they were compared to Disney platform games on the Super NES. That all changed though when I picked up Doom on the PlayStation. For all the doubts that I had about first-person shooter games, Doom immediately grabbed me with its tight gameplay and super smooth graphics. It was so immersive and was genuinely like nothing I'd ever played before. Now, I don't think I need to tell you what Doom's all about, but here's the short version. You take control of the all-powerful Doom guy as you shoot your way through each maze-like level, finding keys to open doors and ultimately making it to the exit. Inside those levels are a ton of horrific undead soldiers and monsters, all trying to keep you from doing just that. But you'll have more than enough weapons to rip and tear your way through each one. The PlayStation version of Doom is surprisingly good for being a console that only cost a few $100 at the time, especially compared to PCs that cost 3 times that much just to get a version that ran this well. The PlayStation version also came with extra levels and a completely redone soundtrack that you either love or hate. It's definitely something that sounds more like it should be on a haunted house CD than a Doom game, but it helped the immersion when I was blasting this one through my stereo speakers at home. This was actually one of my most played early PlayStation games. It was always fun to jump in and make my way through a level or two just to see what neat surprises the game would throw at me. It also started a love for first-person shooter games that no other game had done up to that point. I may have been late to the Doom party, but even still, the PlayStation version was a great introduction. NFL Gameday for the PlayStation was one of those games you buy because, man, it just looks so damn good. Make no mistake about it, I was not a sports fan back then. I'd occasionally have a football game or basketball game in my library, but it was pretty rare and it was just nothing I really cared about too much. I definitely wasn't into scoring points with the sports ball as a kid, but that's the power of the PlayStation launch. It made you want games that you didn't even care about with just how damn good they looked. And NFL Gameday looked really good. See, you gotta understand that this is what football games look like before NFL Gameday. This is Madden on the Sega Genesis. Notice how it totally looks like Madden on the Sega Genesis would look. Even if you've never heard or seen Madden on the Sega Genesis, this is exactly what your brain thinks it looks like. Alright, now compare that to NFL Gameday. This blew my mind the first time I saw it. This game looks so damn good that I learned how to play football solely from playing this game so much. But did this new love for football games that NFL Gameday inspired continue? Well, no, but it was more than enough to have a lot of fun with for several months after I got my PlayStation. Now, I have been told by several people that NFL Gameday is a solid football game, so at least I don't feel too dumb for liking it so much. But should you play this one today? Well, I don't really know. Probably not. I'm sure there are better football games on the PlayStation, including the many sequels that NFL Gameday eventually got. Toshinden for the PlayStation was the game that I was looking forward to the most. I was a huge fighting game fanatic at the time, and the first time that I laid eyes on Toshinden at a demo kiosk at a local media play was magical. It looked amazing with its large, well-rendered characters fighting and flipping around fully 3D stages. Just like first-person shooters, up to this point I was convinced that 3D fighting games were completely inferior to their 2D counterparts. But Toshinden convinced me that there was definitely something to this three-dimensional thing. Toshinden's biggest gimmick is that you can roll out of the way of oncoming attacks, which was a great way to show off the 3D arenas. It also just felt totally satisfying to jump out of the way of an attack at the last minute and then kick the other player upside the head to punish them for even thinking that you weren't this good at video games. Unfortunately, besides the incredible graphics and cool 3D dodging, Toshinden didn't really have much more going for it. The fighting was mostly stiff and sluggish, with special moves feeling more like they'd happen when the game felt like it wanted to do them, rather than your precise inputs. And while that dodge roll did look really cool, it unfortunately made for a lot of awkward camera angles where you couldn't even see your character sometimes. Toshinden was definitely more flash than substance, but man, it was really good at that flash. And honestly, I think just about everyone had a copy of Toshinden in their library at one point. It's not something I really come back to and play these days, but I'll never forget just how much it made me lose my mind back in the day. And to its credit, it single-handedly made me want to play more 3D fighting games in the future.
No problem!
ESPN Extreme Games for the PlayStation was another game that was constantly being played at that demo kiosk. Now, if you notice that I keep talking about this random demo kiosk at a media play, well, that was generally what was responsible for making me want a PlayStation. They put it up months before the console even came out, and it was loaded with a lot of games on this list. And ESPN Extreme Games actually seemed to be the one that was always being played by someone or had a crowd gathered around it. The game itself is more of a take on something like Road Rash or even Skitchin for the Genesis. Except here you choose from various extreme forms of travel like mountain bikes, rollerblades, or even street luge. You follow a linear path from start to finish, avoiding obstacles and hitting tricks when you can. You can also beat the hell out of other opponents by swiping or kicking at them as they come by, and it can be pretty satisfying to watch them careen off the screen with a few well-placed kicks. It's a fun arcade-style racing game, but what really drew attention to the demo kiosk was the incredibly fluid 3D scrolling. This legit looked like having an arcade racing game in your living room. Plus, it was scientifically proven that if you put the word extreme on anything in the 90s, kids would eat it up. and that's exactly what I did with Extreme Games. Now, I did have fun with this one, but this was another one of those launch discs that would get some play if I was bored with my other games. It was fun to pull out and show off what the system could do, but otherwise it didn't get a ton of play. This game would also eventually be renamed to like One Extreme or something dumb like that since Sony lost the ESPN license, but it's the same game otherwise. A game that you're probably safe to pass on, unless you're like me and just too damn extreme. While Extreme Games may have been a disappointing racing game, Wipeout for the PlayStation was anything but. If there was one game that I knew that I wanted at the PlayStation launch, it was Wipeout. A lot of the games on this list definitely impressed with their graphics, but were usually lacking in the gameplay department. But Wipeout absolutely excelled at both. This one nailed everything for me. I loved the super futuristic vibe of the whole thing, plus it looked and ran better than just about anything else on the console at launch. If you've never played Wipeout, then just think of it as F-Zero on steroids. You pick from a selection of sleek-looking hovercraft and then try to make your way to first place using a combination of turbo boosting around crazy roller coaster-like tracks and picking up weapons to blast your fellow racers to the back of the pack with. What made Wipeout so unique was how the racing was physics-based. Your hovercraft actually felt like heavy machines that are whipping around corners carried by your speed. And if you got good enough at winding through each track without slowing yourself down, it just felt magical. Wrap all of that up with an incredible electronic soundtrack, and you've got the best PlayStation launch game hands down. I was so enamored with this one that I'd actually draw the ships in my sketchbook at school. And the soundtrack also got me to seek out other electronic music at my local music store, since electronic music was actually just finding its footing here in the West around then. So yeah, Wipeout was more than just a game for me. It actually shaped a lot of the things that I still enjoy to this day. And of course, this was the game that I spent the most time with out of everything on this list. And I'll always come back to it when I want to remember what it was like to experience the original PlayStation's launch. Rayman for the PlayStation was probably the game that I felt the most at home with on the console. For all the crazy new 3D experiences on Sony's new system, my favorite genre of a basic 2D platformer was pretty much nowhere to be seen, besides Rayman. Sony was convinced that 3D games were the future, and I guess they were right, but thankfully Ubisoft was around to show off what the PlayStation could do with a good old 2D mascot platformer. And while Rayman was definitely a solid playing game, I remember this one impressing me with its gorgeous 2D art more than a lot of those crazy new 3D games did. This was the type of art and color depth that I could only dream of on 16-bit platforms. But here was Rayman on my TV, looking like it had jumped out of a storybook with its super detailed art and fluid animation. After those looks wear off though, you're left with a platformer that would have felt just as at home on the Super NES or Genesis. You essentially navigate each level to rescue trapped Electoons that are hidden around each stage. All you have to do is run and jump your way through some pretty fun levels to find them with the help of Rayman's unique powers that he finds in some stages, like his iconic fist punch that lets you charge it up and blast enemies from across the screen. The Electoons themselves aren't required to beat each level, but they're a fun reason to go back and replay levels again to find them all, especially for a completionist like me. While Rayman may have been the game that I felt the most familiar with on the console at launch, it ended up being the game that I actually played the least. While it definitely wowed with its art, it was still just a 2D platformer, and I played a lot of those in the past 10 years. There were just so many new experiences on the PlayStation that I wanted to play instead. Rayman's still a really fun platform game, but it was definitely one that didn't quite grab me like I expected it would. Speaking of new experiences, here's Twisted Metal for the PlayStation. Now, yes, I am aware that there were car combat games on 16-bit consoles, like Rock and Roll Racing and even Battle Cars for the Super NES, but Twisted Metal was a whole new beast. This one completely tossed the whole racing aspect out the window and instead turned the tracks into arenas to do battle in, sometimes even entire city blocks to destroy. The goal was simple: pick the most cracked out vehicle you can find and then jump into an arena with a bunch of other cracked out vehicles and be the last one standing. To do so, you've got a ton of power-ups laying around each arena, like landmines, missiles, homing missiles, other kinds of missiles I think, basically just a lot of missiles. Combine the hectic pace to make it to those power-ups before other cars do, along with some very loose physics, and this just feels like chaos, but the best kind of chaos. Now, contrary to what you might be thinking, I didn't much care for this first Twisted Metal game. Yes, it was novel and completely different, but it just didn't have the staying power with me. I think I played this one like half a dozen times and then just ended up trading it for some credit towards something new. I really didn't get into this whole car combat thing until its much, much better sequel hit the PlayStation the next year. Still though, this was a nice look into what would become an incredibly popular genre in just a few years. I'd only really recommend playing this one today if you want to see Twisted Metal's humble beginnings, or just the most jacked up looking sweet tooth you've ever seen. Otherwise, there's way better car combat games out there, including way better Twisted Metal games. And there we go. Those were the games that instantly take me back to Christmas 1995. Those games not only represent some of my favorite gaming memories, but also just a great time in general for me. I was a junior in high school and I just got my first job. Admittedly, I got that job to buy these games with, but it was still a lot of fun. It's the stuff you think back to when being an adult just gets a bit too overwhelming. I'm sure all of you have those memories too, so let me know in the comments if you have any favorites from the PlayStation launch, or just any games that give you some nice memories. Also, if you guys like this video, do me a favor and click that like button, or even a sub if you're feeling extra generous. As for me, I'll be back next time with a few more games to talk about, so I'll see you then.